about 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and because of the fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had one window, which led into the living room, and none with outside access. The window will be important later. It was 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for the master tenant, and one spare, which at the time was rented out by a pretty friendly guy. Well, friendly guy had issues with his work visa and had to move back to Canada last minute, leaving us about 2 weeks to find another roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no part in the selection process, but was content when the new roommate moved in a little later. He seemed a bit off, but friendly. He was a very tall, large guy but pretty quiet, and not someone I wanted to go out of my way to hang with, but was okay to be around and be cordial with. About 2 weeks into his move-in, the master tenant left for Hawaii, leaving him and I alone in the home for the month-long duration of his stay. For the first few days, things are normal. All of a sudden, about 4 days into the trip, I am woken up at about 8 a.m. to a frantic knocking at my door. Roommate, we'll call him Kyle, is standing there when I open up, looking frazzled. He looks me dead in the eye and says, "So do you want to tell me what went on last night?" To which I was shocked and confused, because I had come home from work at about 9 p.m. and immediately showered and went to bed. I explained this to him, and he tells me that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room, that he saw me in the side alley out the window, arguing with our landlord, whom I'd never even seen at that point, that he heard people coming in and out of our house. I tell him no way, none of that ever happened. After staring at me for a little longer, he leaves and doesn't bring it up again. The next morning, I wake up to the same thing. This time he says he saw me arguing with my boyfriend. I was single at the time, had seen me talking with our other roommate who's in Hawaii, and asking me for the badge number of the officer I'd spoken to, since he had apparently seen me talking to a bunch of police as well. This time, I get angry and more or less tell him to cut this stuff out, because I'm not doing anything and don't know what he's talking about. He gets a weird look on his face and says I think I had a seizure in my sleep. The next time it happens, call an ambulance, and leaves for a bit, only to start knocking again about an hour later, and when I open up, Kyle repeats the exact same story verbatim. This happens once more before I tell him to leave me the hell alone and leave for work. I go to work as normal, and I am reluctant to return that night, but am too tired to switch to an alternate location. Big mistake. About 1 a.m., I wake up to slamming doors. Kyle is pacing back and forth between his bedroom, the living room, and out the front door, walking in and out of each room, turning the lights on and off, mumbling angrily and slamming the doors. I can see his figure pacing back and forth through the frosted window in my room that leads to the living room. Since my room is dark, he cannot see inside. Suddenly he screams, "I can't live like this. Why are you doing this to me?" I think he's on the phone and don't respond. A few moments later, he screams my name repeatedly, and I realize he's directing it towards me. I knew I had to get the hell out of there, so I very quietly creep out of bed and start getting dressed and packing a bag of clothes for work in the morning. I'm almost done when he screams, "I hear you," and charges over to my room, slapping the wall next to my door but not touching the door itself. I look towards my window and see his shadow lean all the way forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I was terrified and sat completely still, unmoving. He eventually screams my name again and moves away from the window, and I hear him start pacing between rooms again. Now, my shoes are kept on a rack outside my door and not inside my room, so I know that when I leave I'm going to need a moment to put them on. I decide to wait until his pacing takes him out the front door again, at which time I plan to grab my shoes, put them on and run. As I'm formulating this plan, the pacing stops. He screams, "Do you want to fight about this? Come out right now and we'll fight, I swear to God." I'm a very small girl, and this guy is easily 3 times my size, so I am definitely not looking to fight things. After a few minutes, he turns off all the lights, and I hear the door to his room open and close, followed by silence. I wait for a moment to be sure I can't hear any movement, and then decide to take my chance. I took a breath and pulled my door open quickly. I step out and grab my shoes before I look up a second later and see him standing shirtless with just a pair of boxers and socks on in the dark of the hallway, his arms hung slightly outward in an awkward position. he says in a low, calm voice. "Ma'am, we need to talk." That was a hard no from me, so I grab my shoes and run out the door with them in hand. I run about a half block barefoot before I stop to put them on. When I look back, he is standing in the porch light of our front door, watching me run but not moving. Luckily, I had a friend who lived 2 blocks away, and I had their spare key, so I let myself in and crashed there for the night. And that's where I stayed for the next week or so while we worked things out with the master tenant, and Kyle agreed to move out within the week. He says he doesn't remember anything that happened, or wasn't sure if it was real or not, but if I said that's what went down, then it must be real. The day Kyle left, he sends me a photo of the house keys sitting on the table and says I'm out, nothing else. I take a friend over there with me to scout it and ensure that he has actually left. When we get there, we discover that not only had he left a ton of food and furniture, but he had ripped all of the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He had unscrewed and removed the deadbolt to the front door and left them lined up neatly on the front table. We then realize that my front door can only lock by using a key from the outside, and it had been locked when we arrived, meaning Kyle still had a key. We called a locksmith immediately. Even after changing the locks, I was still terrified to stay there alone afterwards, and never went to sleep at night without barricading the doors with chairs and other furniture. To this day, I still fear for his safety. He was obviously psychologically unstable, but also wonder what could have happened if I hadn't been as lucky as I was. It was New Year's Eve, my birthday, and myself and 2 of my friends were out the front of my house listening to music on my iPod. We were about 12 at the time, and there was no one else around. It was probably between 10 and 10:30 at night, and we were waiting for the illegal fireworks to light up down the street. Happened every year at this time. It probably sounds a little weird, 12-year-old kids by themselves at 10:30 p.m. listening to Katy Perry in the middle of the street, but it wasn't too unusual. See, my neighborhood is very close. We know all of our neighbors really well, so our parents who were in the house and ourselves weren't at all concerned. We were listening to Hot and Cold by Katy Perry. Yes, it was that time of the decade, and we're jamming along to it when we began to hear a whistle. Now, first off, it sounded like it was part of the song, so initially everyone ignored it, but that was until it started to distort and go out of rhythm to the music playing. It didn't seem to be in tune with the song, and it was eerily out of pitch. I don't know why, maybe to hear it better, but my friend decided to pause the music. Maybe it was just in the song, or maybe the phone was glitching. As soon as the music stopped, the whistling continued, pitchy and slow. We were a little bit spooked. It was dark outside other than the few street lights on the road. We couldn't really see much or make much out of the darkness other than the strange whistling. We were able to pinpoint the direction it was coming from soon enough. We turned towards it and froze. About 10 meters from where we stood, just on the edge of the street lamp's light, was a man. He looked quite disheveled, most likely homeless, and he was just standing there, looking at us, whistling that god-forsaken pitchy whistle. We all were frozen for a while, as I guess we were caught off guard, until my fight or flight kicked in. I yelled at my friends to get inside, and they began to scream and run up the driveway. I pushed and shoved them forward, terrified because I don't know whether they could hear what I was hearing, but the whistling had finally stopped. But something else was drowning out the silence. Heavy-setted footsteps. He was chasing after us. I screamed bloody murder at them, opening the front door and shoving them inside, not caring if I hurt them. I turned and slammed the deadbolt just as he reached the screen door. I watched as his figure came into view. He was dirty, wearing soiled long-sleeved clothes, had an unkempt beard, and wore a torn beanie. As I closed the door, he stopped just ahead of the screen, looked me dead in the eye, and murmured something that still makes my skin crawl. Damn it. One of my friends consoled the other, who was now in tears, as I watched him through the peephole. He lingered for a second more, then disappeared into the blackness. I remember my friends grabbing me, asking if I was okay, and then pointing down to my hands. I was shaking like a leaf. We never told our parents. This was over 10 years ago, and it still gives me the heebie-jeebies to think what would have happened if we hadn't noticed the out-of-place whistling. Disheveled old whistler, let's not meet. The weekend after my 24th birthday in February this year, I went on a blind date that ended atrociously as the person I met smelled like a skunk and was a liar. That's not the scary part, though. I bought a ticket for my date and myself, but the movie didn't start for another 45 minutes, so I just waited in the theater lobby until she would show up. I was on the far left corner of a bench when a large burly man walked up to the bench and sat directly next to me. "Hi," he said. As a slightly awkward guy, I sheepishly said, "Hi." The man smiled, opened up his coat, reached in and pulled out a package of salami. "This is the best salami. You want to buy some?" he asked. "No thanks, I'm full," I said. He raised his eyebrows and put the salami back in his coat. In the same movement, however, he pulled out a package of cheese. "And this cheese, you want to buy some goddamn good pepper jack?" He leaned towards me with this question. "No, I'm afraid not," he sighed, put the cheese back in his coat and zipped it up. The man was silent for the next 5 minutes, but my heart was pounding from being uncomfortable. The man finally relented and nudged me. He pointed at the poster for Mockingjay. "That's a fine-ass logo," he smirked. I looked at the poster. "It is pretty cool, isn't it?" I forced myself to say, "I'm a tattoo artist. I gotta put it on someone. Maybe you." "Yeah, I would love to ink your canvas. I mean, you're well built. One could do wonders with your skin." I went wide-eyed in dismay at how creepy this guy was. I couldn't even respond at this point. "I'm also a musician. I bet you have great vocal cords. I'd love to audition you." He smiled at me. "Maybe another time, man. I'm meeting my date any second now," I said. "Is she hot?" he said, with his tone deeper and more serious. "I don't know. We'll see." "Well, lucky her," he said. He reached out and stroked my hairline and ran his finger through my admittedly long hair. "Lucky her." I sprang to my feet and stomped out of the theater. "Ah, come on, man. You can't just leave me like." He shouted after me when a theater usher stomped up to him and yelled at him to leave. After 3 minutes, I re-entered the theater, and the creep was nowhere to be seen. I can handle myself, but I felt violated by the whole incident. Let's not meet. Update: as a point of clarification, some women socializing at the other end of the bench had caught sight of him doing his hair bull, which prompted them to confront him just as I was leaving. The theater staff jumped in just as I was exiting the building. Hi, my name's Tom. I live in the St. Louis area. And this is a horror story about something that happened to me that almost screwed up my life forever. When I was 21 years old, I broke up with my first ever serious girlfriend who I had been together with for 8 months. Needless to say, I was devastated. I fell into a deep depression, and I began abusing painkillers and Xanax really heavily. And I began looking for any chick I could find to rebound with. I ended up looking on the personal section on Craigslist, and I found an ad for a girl named Stephanie. I began talking to her, and I arranged for her to come pick me up that night. We had intercourse that night, and decided to make it a regular thing. She was an older lady, about 35, and a bigger girl, but she had her own apartment, and enough money to keep me loaded on as much drugs and alcohol as I wanted. To be honest, I kind of used this lady, and used her as my sugar mama for a better lack of a word. After a while, she grew really attached to me and started to want a more serious relationship. Eventually, she started dropping hints about wanting to get married. She said she wanted to do this to help me out so she could get me on her insurance so I can get help for my drug and alcohol problem, which I refused to consider. One day we got into a big argument, and she told the police that I had been abusing her and got a temporary restraining order on me. A week after she did this, she called me crying her eyes out saying, "Please forgive me, I love you," and all this other stuff, and said she wanted to come pick me up, buy me some dope and alcohol, and get me something to eat. And being the addict I am, I of course accepted. From the moment she picked me up, I noticed that she was acting kind of odd. She was usually really talkative, and was always on my ass wanting to talk to me about this and that, but on this day she was oddly quiet. When we got back to her apartment after I walked in, she immediately pushed me on the couch and pulled my pants down, and we began having intercourse. Then she climbed off of me and she seemed angry. I had been getting bad vibes off of her the whole night, so after this happened I immediately asked her for a ride back home, which she quickly agreed to do. After I got dropped off at the house, I went inside and I sat down my sister and watched some SpongeBob with her. About 10 minutes after I was home, I got a call on the phone. I picked up the phone, and to my surprise, a lady on the other end said, "This is the St. Louis County Police Department. We're going to need you to come outside to talk to you." I ran downstairs and hid my weed and my pills, and then walked outside to figure out what the hell was going on. When I walked outside, there were about 7 different cops on my porch, and they were all pointing tasers and guns at me. One of them hit me in the back of my leg with a nightstick and put me on the ground, and I was handcuffed. The cops then talked to my mom and got permission to go inside of the house, where they took a drug dog and began doing a thorough search of my room and my basement area. None of the cops on the scene would tell me what was going on. Whenever I would ask a question about why were they there, they told me I would have to talk to the detective at the station. When I got to the police station, I had a bombshell dropped on me. Apparently this lady had accused me of kidnapping her and sexually assaulting her. She told the police that she had come by my house to return some of my stuff because we had just broken up, and that I had come out, held a knife to her throat, and forced my way into her vehicle, took her back to her apartment, and sexually assaulted her repeatedly. Thankfully, I had remembered that we made a couple stops on the way to her apartment. She had gone inside of a gas station to get a couple packs of cigarettes with me, so there was no way that I could have kidnapped her. The police still swabbed me for DNA, and they also took my clothes for evidence, and I was forced to spend the night in the St. Louis County Jail wearing only hospital scrubs. I was released the next morning, but my ordeal was far from over. This lady began constantly stalking me. She would call me every night at odd times from blocked numbers and either crying into the phone or just beg to talk to me. I also began seeing her vehicle quite a lot in the neighborhood, even though she lives nowhere close to me. I called the police about this a couple times, but they didn't really seem to care. They told me I would have to go get a restraining order on her in order to make it stop. I wanted nothing to do with the court system though, because I have a criminal record, and I just decided to ignore her, and I hoped that the problem would go away. After a couple months, she finally did stop bothering me. However, to this day, sometimes I get calls at 2 or 3 in the morning from blocked numbers, and every new girlfriend I get, she messages them on Facebook and tells them how I sexually assaulted her. Moral of the story: be careful who you meet online. Whether you're a guy or a girl, all it takes is one crazy person to completely ruin your life.